so moving on to our next topic, which is fluid flow, right? Especially with rate of flow. This topic is actually pretty related to cardiovascular system, which we covered, I believe, last week, right? And some of this you may remember, right? And we're just going to talk about the different variables that could affect flow rate, how fast something flows, okay? Again, you may remember there's direct connection between the pressure and the flow rate. There's also a connection between actually height and flow rate. If you have, say, a pipe, right? You have a pipe that starts over here, then the pipe that's filled with water, with flowing water, then you go straight, and then the pipe goes downward, then it goes to the right. You have two different sections of pipe. The flow here and the flow here will be different, right? They won't be flowing at the same rate usually, right? Because height plays a role in flow rate as well. And you can actually see this based on this equation, which is extremely important. Whenever you see something involving flow rate, you should probably think of this one or the next one, which I'm about to show. It's called Bernoullis Principle or Bernoullis Equation, where P1 is equal to the static pressure, where P is the static pressure of the fluid. And if you want to think about it, it actually maybe might help to think of it. Bernoullis Principle is a very, very, very closely related to conservation of energy, right? And you'll see why I say that, right? So it's looking at two different moments, right? One, like P1, V1, H1, this refers to moment one. This is the information at moment one. This is the information at moment two, right? So we're talking at two different moments, right? And we're comparing two different moments in time, right? So P1 is the pressure of the fluid, the static pressure of the fluid. Then 1/2 rho v squared, right? Rho, again, I mentioned, is the density of the fluid. V1 is the velocity of the fluid at moment one squared, plus rho gh. Rho, again, density. G is 9.8, acceleration due to gravity. And h is the elevation of the fluid. If you notice, this actually looks really, really familiar. This looks almost exactly like the conservation of energy. And this is why I mentioned that. Conservation of energy is, say, something like the internal energy plus 1/2 mv squared plus mgh. Those are the three main forms of energy, right? Kinetic energy, which is 1/2 mv squared, and potential energy, which is pmh, right? Mgh, sorry, mgh, right? Here, it's very, very similar, at 1/2 rho v squared, rho gh. The only difference is instead of mass for a liquid, we're using rho, density, right? And instead of any kind of internal energy, we're using P, which is pressure. And just like with conservation of energy, and looking at the second moment, it's equal to the pressure, 1/2 rho v squared plus rho gh at the second moment, right? Essentially, this is almost exactly the same as conservation of energy, except just for fluids and fluid flow. What would happen, and now I want to ask you guys this in the chat, and I want you guys to just answer in the chat. It's not a poll question. What would happen if you kept the pressure the same and everything else the same? So obviously density of water doesn't change no matter what you do. Density of water doesn't change. What would happen if you increase the velocity, right? And what would happen to the height if you increase velocity and then didn't touch the pressure? If you kept the pressure constant, what would happen to the height? What would have to happen to the height? Or, yeah. Or you can think of it vice versa. If you, and actually I think it might help to think, if you increase the height, if you went from a low position to a high position, right? The pipe went upwards, what would happen to the velocity from moment one to moment two? So if this is low and this is high, what would happen to the velocity? Which one will be low, which one will be high? So yeah, so exactly, velocity are inverse, right? So for example, if you increase the height, the velocity decreases, low, and this becomes high. Exactly, good job. Perfect. Right, So this is kind of like the impact that something like this could have, right? If you manage to keep the pressure constant. If you can't keep the pressure constant, you would actually have pressure shifting as well. Okay. So next up is the continuity equation, right? And if you took a physics class, and I remember my physics professor at Sternberg when I was learning this for the first time a couple years ago, he mentioned if Bernoullis equation is something like Batman, continuity equation is his Robin, right? They're very related to each other, and they always go together when you're answering some kind of fluid related question. They're very usually partnered up together. The way that they're partnered up usually is they'll give you an area. So rho, it doesn't matter, right? In the continuity equation, this is the full equation. But look, if rho, again, water doesn't change density. So rho AV, you can just cancel out the rho, right? Because they're the same on both sides. It doesn't matter. Essentially, it's just AV1, A1, V1, A2, V2. Usually what they'll do is they'll give you the cross-sectional area, and they'll have you find V1 and V2. And then once you find V1 and V2, you can substitute V1 and V2 into these, right? And then you could solve for whatever they're asking for, either pressure or height or something like that, right? And that's what he means by Batman and Robin. They usually work together. It's because most questions involving this will actually be 2 parts, 2 steps. They're very related. They're like very, well, yeah, the properties are very related. You use one to find the other. How would changing cross-sectional area, and we'll talk about that in a second, how would changing A affect, say, the height? How would changing A affect the pressure? How would doing this affect that, right? These 2 equations are very closely related, and they'll very often, you'll use these 2 together to solve any kind of problem, okay? So like I mentioned, V is velocity, rho is density, but again, density you can essentially cancel it out. But A is now cross-sectional area of the container. So let me just quickly explain what that is. So for example, if you had a pipe, so imagine this was a pipe, right? The cross-sectional area is this area right here, the dotted part. So if you were looking, so if the pipe is like this, if you went and looked at it like this, like on like the face, so this circle, and then it extends like backwards, right? The cross-sectional area is this shaded region of a pipe, or it could be a pipe, it could be a vessel like an artery or a vein or something like that, right? It could be, if we're talking about cardiovascular system, or if we're talking more about in the physics sense, because this type of question could appear either in the biology section where it asks you for something with cardiovascular. It could appear in the physics section where it asks you just about like a pipe or some kind of tank or something like that, right? This is how you would do it, right? And that's what cross-sectional area means. It means this like circular area, and cross-sectional area is always a circle, or almost always a circle, right? Again, smaller cross-sectional area means a narrower pipe vessel, and thus you need a higher velocity in order to maintain the equation. Again, as you guys mentioned for the previous equation, if going from a high to low area, right? Obviously, the velocity would increase in order to maintain the equilibrium, right? If you decrease the area, you have to increase the velocity in order to keep the equation or the equation true, since rho is the same on both sides, right? And remember, Bernoulli equation and continuity equation are very closely related. Most of the time, you'll be asked to use both to solve an equation, so try it out. So the most popular answer was actually C. However, it was fairly close. The correct answer is actually A, and all 4 answer choices were relatively even. So let me go over this step by step, and then hopefully we can see why that is. Okay. According to your understanding of Bernoulli continuity equation, which is the following statements accurately describes the phenomenon of vascular flutter, which occurs when an artery becomes constricted due to accumulated plaque, right? So what will the artery look like? An artery is essentially just a pipe, so it would look something like this. But then there's this area where it's constricted, so it would look like this, and then like that. Here, let me draw the other side as well. Okay. So this is what approximately what it would look like, obviously not exactly, but and fluid is flowing this way, right? When you reach this area, which is the blockage, let's think what would happen. Well, we know that area decreases, and we know that as area decreases, due to the continuity equation, velocity at that point would have to increase. And somebody mentioned the Venturi effect is actually exactly this, right? As the cross-sectional area here before the blockage is high, the velocity is low. Then during this area, the size of the cross-sectional area is lower, and so the speed is much higher. And then at this point again, it widens again, and the cross-sectional area goes back to being its original, and the speed goes back to its original speed if the cross-sectional area goes back to its original speed. This is called also the Venturi effect, but you don't really have to know that. Just if you know the principle, it doesn't matter. But yeah. So we know that cross-sectional area in this area goes down, velocity goes up. Well, now let's look at, I'm gonna actually clear this. I'm gonna clear my drawing. Hopefully you guys have it kind of like remembered. As A goes down, B goes up. And now let's look at the equation, the Bernoullis equation. I'm just writing it down really quick. So I'm not going to draw it on the other side, but you get the idea. It's the same on the other side. We know that rho is constant. We can get rid of rho. We can get rid of 1/2 because that doesn't change from side to side. Both sides have 1/2. Both sides have rho here, rho doesn't change. G doesn't change. G is a constant. Height, they didn't mention that height was changing, so height is the same. The only variables left that are changing are velocity from the left side to the right side. So imagine all of this was also copy and pasted to the right side. The only thing that changes from left to right is, or from before to after, is the velocity and the pressure. Velocity went up. If the velocity here is lower than it is here on the right side, on the after side, right? The velocity before is lower than the velocity after. Well, that means the pressure before has to be higher than the pressure after in order to balance out and keep the equation true, right? So if P2, P1, 2 squared, right? So you'll get, you have to, again, they're inversely proportional. So pressure, because velocity went up and all of the other variables stayed the same except for pressure. Pressure is the only variable that it can change. Pressure has to go down, right? So that means the constriction causes a pressure drop. Let's look at the answer choices. So A, the constriction causes the pressure drop. Yes. Constriction causes the pressure build right before the narrowing. Not exactly, not necessarily true, right? The pressure right at the narrowing, that's obviously not true. Before the narrowing, nothing would really change based on the continuity equation, the Bernoullis principle. Nothing would change right before, nothing would change right after the narrowing. So immediately you could eliminate C and D, because according just to the Bernoullis equation and Bernoullis equation and continuity equation, they're only looking at really cross-sectional area and its effect. If the cross-sectional area right before and right after are the same, it doesn't matter. The pressure and everything else like that will not change. Whereas, so we're not looking at things like backup. We're not looking at things like blood will travel faster, but that actually is wrong, because if blood is traveling faster and the velocity is increased, the pressure would have to decrease, but that's not what this is saying. And as you get right after the narrowing, the velocity will just go back right back to normal after the constriction, right? Because at that area, so if we draw it again, like this, if we change the moment to look like this moment and this moment rather than one of the moments here, area is the same, that means velocity is the same. The area here and the area here are the same. Continuity equation states velocity here and velocity here will be the same as well.